Good morning, boys and girls. My name's Mr. Zach. You might remember me, and I'm going to be your host today. Today, your teacher is going to be Miss Katie. And we're going to continue learning all about the Earth, inside and out. So listen up.
By the end of today's lesson, you'll be able to write and illustrate a diagram of the different layers of the Earth that Mr. Zach actually talked about in the previous lesson. We will also be able to discuss the layers of the Earth with a peer or someone at home. So by the time you get done listening really closely, you should be able to go and tell someone about what you learned. Last but not least, you will be able to orally retell a lot of important facts that you'll hear from today's Read Aloud. So let's get started. So in our last lesson, we talked about many different things that has to do with this right here. This is called a globe. And on the globe, we have many different parts. However, the parts that we want to review today are, we live on top of the crust. And the globe has different parts, of course, but the North Pole, and we have the South Pole. On the globe as well, we can also identify where we live, which is here in the United States of America. I am currently in Jackson, Mississippi, and it's really hard to see this on the globe, but here in the United States, in the continent of North America, is where we are today. All right, so now we're going to talk about three important words that we talked about in the previous lessons that are very, very important as it relates to the study of the Earth. So, three words: heat, pressure, and time. Don't forget, heat, pressure, and time causes changes to the Earth. And those are the three words that we have to remember when we study geology, which is the study of the Earth. Now, before we get started, I want to kind of build our background knowledge as it relates to three different terms. We have solid, which is a solid, like this book here, keeps its shape. A liquid, which is like water or anything that's a liquid. Water is a very good example. A liquid takes the shape of its container, and I'm going to show you a little bit about that in a second. And last but not least, gas. And here I have a picture of a little boy in front of an air conditioner. A gas is hard to see and does not have a shape. So now I'm going to ask Mr. Zach to come and help me, and we're going to kind of demonstrate what a solid, liquid, and gas is.
All right, I can't wait.
So here we have a book. A book is a solid object. And this solid it means no matter where I put it, on the table, hold it in the air, if I hand it to Mr. Zach, it still keeps its shape because it's a solid. So remember, a solid keeps its shape. Okay, our next activity we're going to do is I have a small clear container and I have some water. As you can see, the water is already in the container. And if you look closely, you can see that it's in a cylinder-shaped form at this very moment because it's in its own container. So here we have all of this water that's in this container, and it's in a cylinder-type shape. But if I take a different type of container, as you can see here, this container is a completely different shape than this one. Of course, it's shorter, it's wider, but it will still hold liquid. So I'm going to take this water and I'm going to pour it into this container. Now, is this water still in a cylinder shape? If you said no, you are exactly right, because this water is now taking the shape of this other container. So don't forget, a liquid, like water, takes the shape of its container. And last but not least, I don't have an exact example, but gas is hard to see and it does not have a shape. So you can think of a gas such as like the air, the wind, like in this picture.
Like when you're blowing on your hand.
Yeah, you can even blow on your hand, but you can't see it, but you can feel it. So don't forget that a gas is very hard to see, however, and it does not have a shape. So don't forget, solid, liquid, and gas. Thank you, Mr. Zach.
Thank you.
Before we get started today in our Read Aloud, I want to build a little bit of background knowledge as it relates to what we're going to study. You've learned a little bit about this in previous lessons, but we're going to get a little bit deeper inside the earth this time. So over here we have some vocabulary words. Our first word is disaster. That's an event that causes destruction. In my picture, there's just a little image here of many different types of disasters, from tornadoes to fires to flooding. Many things can cause destruction, and they are called a disaster. Our next word is liquid, meaning moving or flowing freely. Just like we talked about a second ago, water is a liquid. Our third word is molten, means made liquid by heat. And here you can see how they've melted down some metal to make it into a molten form. So it's turning into a liquid, so it's molten. Number 4 is solid. We talked about this a second ago. Solid keeps its shape. When we take water and we freeze it, it turns into a solid, which is what we call ice. Last but not least, volcano. A mountain formed by the ejection of lava, gases, and ash from an opening in the Earth's crust. And here we have a picture of a volcano. All right, so now that we've reviewed our vocabulary, we know what a solid, liquid, and gas is, and we also know that heat, pressure, and time are very important words that impact how we study the Earth. Let's get started on our read aloud. Okay, on the screen, in this image, you should see a picture of the Earth. In past lessons, you've probably seen this with Mr. Zach when he discussed the different parts or layers. Today, we're going to talk a little bit more about that. Today, we're going to pretend that we can journey deep, deep into the Earth all the way to the very center, nearly 4,000 miles from where you are sitting right now. The first stop is the layer beneath the crust, which is called the mantle. So here we have the crust, and right beneath the crust, we have the mantle. This is what we're going to talk about. The mantle is a whopping 1,800 miles thick and contains most of the Earth's rock. Because most of the Earth is made of rock, that means that most of the Earth is contained within the mantle. Next, you have the outer core here, and you also have the inner core. On this image, you can see the different layers of the Earth. Let's take a look at this map. Remember, the mantle is 1,800 miles thick. That is the same distance as the distance between Colorado and New York. If you were to travel from Colorado to New York, according to this travel map, it would take you 27 hours and 2 minutes. That is a very long way, but that's also a good way to remember how big or how wide the mantle actually is. Again, you see that the Earth is divided into layers. The mantle is mostly made of solid rock. The closer you get to the crust, the cooler and harder the mantle tends to be. But as you go deeper, closer to the core, the mantle gets hotter and becomes soft and gooey. Heat closer to the core causes the rock inside the mantle to move around quite a bit. But in most places, it is still solid rather than liquid. Remember, a solid keeps its shape and a liquid flows freely. The mantle surrounds the core or the center of the Earth. The core has 2 parts, the inner core and the outer core. The inner core, shown by the green arrow, is a solid metal ball. The outer core, shown by the blue arrow, is also metal, but it is not solid. It is made up of melted or molten metal. Remember, that's one of our vocabulary words. This means that deep down inside the Earth, thousands of miles beneath your feet, there is a giant sea of red-hot molten metal surrounding a solid metal ball. Now, I know that can be hard to understand, but if you look at the picture, the green arrow shows the part that looks and represents the part that is like a metal ball. And then surrounding that, you have more of a molten substance. Scientists believe that the very center of the Earth, the inner core, is actually hotter than the surface of the sun, which is a blazing 10,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Let's take a look more in depth. A really hot day in Mississippi is around 100 degrees. This will cause us to sweat if we are outside too long and do not drink enough water. On my explorations, I have to remember to stay hydrated on hot days. However, if you look at the second number, this is a way larger number. The core of the Earth is 10,000 degrees. This is extremely hot, even hotter than a 100-degree Mississippi day. So if you look at the numbers, you can tell that the 10,000 degrees Fahrenheit number is way larger than the 100 degrees Fahrenheit number, which lets us know that it is way hotter than the number at the top. Again, we're going back to the image of the Earth as it shows its layers. The inner core is much hotter than the outer core. It may seem strange, therefore, that the outer core of the Earth is molten metal, yet the inner core at the very center of the Earth, where it is hottest, which is a solid metal ball, is actually just smaller than the moon. The reason that the inner core is solid has to do with the incredible pressure. Remember our three words: heat, pressure, time. The incredible pressure of the Earth's entire weight pressing inward. The more pressure you put on something, the more heat you need to cause that thing to boil or melt. This is why the metal at the very center of the Earth, the inner core, is solid instead of liquid. Despite the intense heat, there is simply too much pressure caused by the weight of the rest of the Earth. So the center of the Earth cannot melt, and it remains a solid. The crust upon which we live is constantly being changed and reshaped due to heat and pressure caused by the activity in the Earth's mantle and core. The San Bernardino Mountains that you see in this picture, along with many other mountains along the west coast of the United States, from Mexico to Alaska, were created by changes inside the Earth. Did you hear the word pressure? That is one of our vocabulary words. Remember, the parts of the mantle that are the closest to the core are soft and gooey. That hot, gooey material in the mantle does not always stay in the mantle. Sometimes it rises up to the surface. If you look in this image at the very bottom, you can see where the gooey substance is rising from. Every so often, some of that extremely hot molten rock or magma pushes up through the mantle and forces its way into cracks and crevices into the crust. Over time, the magma collects in a magma chamber, such as the one near the bottom of the picture. The heat in the magma chamber releases gas from the magma, which builds up and creates pressure. The pressure builds and builds and builds until one day, boom, the magma erupts in a volcano of lava, ash, gas, and fire. Once it is released from the Earth, the magma becomes lava, flowing liquid rock, which flows across the ground until it cools and hardens into rock once again. So let's think about something. Did you hear the words heat and pressure again? In a previous lesson, you learned that pressure is kind of like taking your hands and pushing against the other hand when you pushed against your hands. Heat and pressure cause volcanoes to erupt. The eruption of lava, ash, gas, and fire forms a mountain called a volcano. Take a look at this picture. I want to give you a few seconds to look at this picture and analyze it and think about what you see. Now that I've told you about volcanoes, let me explain one more thing. Thanks to geologists, we have a pretty good idea when and where these geologic events are likely to occur. Geologists help predict where volcanoes are most likely to occur, and this helps keep people safe by discouraging them from building homes close to dangerous areas. It is not always possible to predict when and where a geologic disaster, remember that's a vocabulary word, which are sudden events that cause a lot of damage, will occur. But geologists work hard to give people as much warning as we can. So let's go back to this picture. In the picture, you see a lot of smoke in the air. You see, of course, a volcano. At home, that's probably one of the first things you noticed. And at the very top of the volcano, you can see the lava, or the molten substance that we talked about earlier that erupts from the magma chamber. This is a very good image of a volcano. Okay, now that we have finished our read aloud, let's review some things we learned today. So on our chart here, we learned that heat, pressure, and time are 3 key words that affect how things or changes happen within the earth. Also, we learned that solids, liquids, and gas. Solid keeps its shape, remember, like a book. A liquid takes the shape of its container. We learned that when we did the water experiment here, and we learned that it went from a cylinder type shape in the bottle to a wider shape when we poured it into this container. We also learned that gases are hard to see and that they are not, or they do not have a shape. So we think about air. You can blow on your hand and you can feel it, but we often cannot see it. You can think about a gas as wind on a windy day. You can't see it. We also learned different vocabulary words that we reviewed at the beginning of our lesson. So now I'm going to have Mr. Zach come and join us, and he's going to help us answer some questions.
I'll do my best.
All right, Mr. Zach, we're going to review what we learned today in our read aloud, and you may actually have some clues as to some of the answers from our previous lessons. But our first question is, what are the names of the layers of the earth?
Okay. Well, I mean, that's easy because I remember teaching that earlier. So if I go back and think about the earth, it's made of different layers, and the outside layer, the one that we're on right now, that's called the crust. Just like the outer, darker part of a piece of bread is called the crust. Underneath that, we have the mantle. And then as we go deeper, we find the Earth's core, which is actually separated into the inner core and the outer core. But all of it really is still the Earth's core.
That's correct. So at home, if you said the layers or parts of the Earth are the crust, the mantle, the outer core, and the inner core, you are exactly right.
Great
Don't
job.
forget, there are 4 different parts. Okay, now that we've described the 4 parts, Mr. Zach, let's talk a little bit more about the mantle. How would you describe the mantle?
Well, it's underneath the crust. It's above the core. It's a lot bigger, it's a lot deeper, it goes a lot deeper than the crust. And when we talk about things like volcanoes and magma,
Yes.
a lot of that molten rock is where it comes from.
That's right, that's right. So the mantle actually contains, like you said, most of the rock from Earth, and it gets hotter and softer the closer we get to the core. So good job. All right, our next question. Now that we've described the mantle, let's describe the outer core. Can you do that?
Well, let me think. As we go, I know this about the Earth so far. As you go deeper towards the center, you're going to have a lot more pressure and a lot more heat. So the Earth, the core, that's right there close to the center. So it's going to be under a lot of pressure and a lot more heat than the other layers above it. And if I remember correctly, it's a lot of molten or melted metal, right? And then the outer core, it still flows a little bit. Is that correct?
Yes, it actually gets a little tricky right here. So boys and girls at home, make sure you listen really close. At this point, when you get to the core, we're talking about 2 separate parts. So the outer core is actually, like he said, melted or molten liquid metal. And we learned that what molten means, we learned that in our vocabulary lesson. So when you think about the outer core, you want to think about it as mostly melted liquid metal, which we call molten. Good job. All right, now that we've described the outer core, let's describe the inner core.
Well, if we think about the core, like we said again, the closer we get to the center or the middle of the Earth, the more heat and the more pressure that the things are going to be under. So if the outer core is still a little bit liquid, I do remember you saying that the inner core, which is even deeper into the center of the Earth, is so much pressure that even though the metal is melted, it still doesn't get to flow because it's being pressed so hard by the weight of the Earth around it.
That's exactly right. So at home, if you said the inner core is like a solid metal ball, like he said, you are exactly right. All right, and last but not least, let's think more about the inner core. He kind of talked a little bit about that, but when we think about the inner core, we know that it is liquid. But how does it remain a solid metal ball? Why?
I'm going to give you a
Think
hint.
about our three important words.
One of these words right
It's
here.
either heat, pressure, or time. Which one of those would make something remain a solid?
One of these makes more sense to me, so I want to give them at home a little bit more time to think about it. You think about it, heat, pressure, and time. And if something is being pushed so hard that it can't move anymore, which word would that be? I think we're talking about pressure.
That's right.
We have a winner.
Pressure is exactly the reason why we have an inner core that is a solid metal ball, and it remains a solid rather than a liquid. All right, great job answering those questions.
Did I get an A?
You do get an A.
Oh, not
Good
an
job.
A plus though. Okay, awesome.
We are so glad you joined us today. All rights and credits from this lesson belong to Core Knowledge Language Arts. We would like to thank them for publicly sharing these materials.
So go out today and share something that you've learned with a parent, a grandparent, a friend, a brother, sister, or even a teacher. Tell them all the awesome things that you've learned about our home planet Earth. And once again, thanks for joining us, and we're going to see you next time.